Hey there, and welcome to this episode of Speaking of. Today we're speaking of the what's known as the Respect for Marriage Act. This is an act, this is a piece of legislation that was passed in the Senate yesterday, and that's November 29? And it's expected to be passed in the House very quickly, and it will be signed into law. It's expected to be signed into law by President Biden fairly soon. And so I want to unpack this a little bit and maybe spend a little time thinking about how, what should we as Christians, how should we as Christians evaluate and think about this piece of legislation and what impact it is going to have on us. First of all, what led to this? I want to say a little bit about how we got here, and then I want to explain just a little bit about what's in the legislation. And then I want to just spend a little time maybe critiquing it and offering some kind of big picture theological thoughts. So what got us here? Well, there were really two, let's call them two sort of cultural forces that were really on a collision course and have been since quite a bit earlier this year. In June, at some point in June, the Dobbs decision in the Supreme Court reversed Roe v. Wade, the piece of legislation that was in effect for 49 years, and once again made abortion a law that, a law that was decided at the state level rather than at the federal level. Now, out of that, the court released its opinion on that. It came out that Justice Clarence Thomas actually said that he thought that the court should revisit many other decisions, including the 2015 Obergefell decision that legalized same-sex marriage. And when that leaked out, then that put a lot of people really nervous, because they feared that the Supreme Court, the next thing that the Supreme Court would want to do is reverse same-sex marriage. And then there were all kinds of questions about what would that mean for people who are already entered into a same-sex marriage. Would they be afforded the rights that they currently have? Would their marriage be valid? It raised a whole host of issues, and so that's the one cultural force is the what was perceived as and the concern over marriage rights for same-sex couples. Now, at the same time, there was another cultural force that has been really sort of moving for quite some time, or let's call it maybe a cultural concern, and that is the threat to religious rights when it comes to particularly to issues of same-sex marriage. And so there's been a lot of uncertainty about this really in the last 10 or 15 years especially, and I can attest to this at even in our church. We've had these conversations. As a church, if you other organizations are asking this too, universities and colleges that are Christian or Jewish or Muslim have been asking the question, well, what if our religious convictions, our sincerely held religious beliefs, would prevent us from participating in anything that can be construed as support for gay marriage? And so there have been concerns that if a church were, say, for example, to refuse to perform a same-sex wedding, that church then could be sued, or they could lose their nonprofit status, or a whole host of other things. Christian adoption agencies have been concerned if they decide that they will not permit a same-sex couple to adopt a child, or other examples like that. Here in the denomination, the question has faced our Christian colleges and universities. In the Christian Reformed Church, Dort University and Calvin University, what do they do if they hold to the traditional belief of marriage, that marriage is intended to be between a man and a woman? Could they lose federal funding? Could they lose tuition assistance for students? All those kinds of questions have come into play. And so in our culture, there's this tension between a desire to protect what many people believe is a right, that is the right to marriage, even in a same-sex relationship, and the need to protect First Amendment rights, that is the right to practice religion. So these forces have been kind of moving in our culture. They've been sort of living in tension for quite some time. In the wake of the reversal, the Dobbs case, which reversed Roe v. Wade back in June, legislatures got together and they tried to pass a bill that was intended just to protect the rights of same-sex couples. So the House comes together, they pass this preemptive bill that would have granted all kinds of protections to same-sex couples. But this bill did nothing to protect the rights of religious organizations, nonprofit religious institutions. And so there was concern about whether that bill would even be able to be passed. And so what happened is the Senate then got together and worked with religious leadership and religious organizations, and they crafted a bill that essentially is a substitute bill. And it includes many of those same protections for same-sex couples, but it also then includes protections for religious institutions. So what does the bill say? Well, first of all, it's I think helpful to know that the bill passed again yesterday. So what is that? November 29. It passed with a vote of, I think it was 61 to 36 in favor, and that means that actually 12 Republican senators, some of the more moderate senators, voted in favor of it. That not an exhaustive list, but like Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, and others voted in favor of the bill. And so it had reasonably good bipartisan support, at least under, in our current cultural climate, to pass a bill like this with, I think, 12 senators in favor of it is from the minority side is actually a pretty good margin. The bill was known as the Respect for Marriage Act, and as I said, it's not law yet. It has to still be passed in the House, and then it has to be signed by President Biden. But that's expected to happen fairly easily. So I'm not a legal scholar, I'm not a legal expert, but doing a little bit of simple research, the law, the Respect for Marriage Act, essentially it does a few things. Some of it is really kind of like cleaning up the books of some old laws that had already been replaced with other laws, that sort of thing. But a couple main things that stick out. First of all, the Respect for Marriage Act repeals the Defense of Marriage Act. The Defense of Marriage Act was passed in 1996, I think, something like that. And it essentially defined marriage as a relationship between one man and one woman. And this repeals that. Now, the thing about that is that law already was sort of superseded by other legislation. The 2015 Obergefell decision actually changed that anyways. And so it really did, in that sense, it really repealing the DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, didn't really do a whole lot. It cleaned up some other laws. It sort of removed some other old language from the books, that sort of thing. It ensures, for example, that interracial marriage is actually protected by the law as well. But here are a couple things that are probably more significant that are worth paying some attention to. In some ways, this law it's a preemptive law. It really it kicks in the case of the Obergefell decision being reversed. In other words, if the Supreme Court decides to hear Obergefell again and hear a challenge to it, and if they vote in favor of reversing that, which many people think is very, very unlikely, and including myself, I don't see that happening. But if it were to happen, what this new law, what the Respect for Marriage Act would do is it would make sure that it's clear that a same-sex marriage would be required to be respected, even in a state that doesn't approve of same-sex marriage, provided the marriage took place in a state where same-sex marriage was approved of. So it essentially requires that both the state and federal governments respect same-sex marriages when a marriage was entered into legally. So, for example, I live in the state of Oregon. Oregon is a very progressive state. It is virtually impossible for me to imagine a scenario where Oregon decides to outlaw same-sex marriage. So even if the Obergefell decision is reversed and states now have the right to decide what constitutes marriage, the likelihood of Oregon ever saying, okay, we're going to define marriage exclusively as between a man and a woman, that's virtually impossible. It's not going to happen. On the other hand, we don't live too far away from the state of Utah, where it's a possibility that Utah would actually take a more traditional stance. And I'm just picking on Utah. I'm not making any predictions, but it's possible that Utah could say, well, we want to define marriage in the more traditional sense between a man and a woman. So let's say a same-sex couple in Oregon gets married in Oregon legally, because under Oregon law it would be legal. And then let's say they decide to move to Utah for whatever reason. This new law says that Utah would have to recognize the marriage that took place in Oregon. So the same-sex couple would have to be acknowledged as a legitimate married couple. So it's really just making sure that those who get married legally will be able to count on protections under the law. They can enjoy all the financial and legal benefits of a married couple. So that's one part of the law. But the other part of the law has to do with protections for religious institutions. I'm going to put this up on the screen, and just so you can see the text of it, because I just copied and pasted it straight from the text. So let me let's do it this way. Let's share my screen here. Hopefully we can do this quick and easy. Here's the text directly from the law itself. It says nonprofit religious organizations. Now, by the way, that's worth noting because it actually doesn't deal with for-profit organizations. This just pertains to nonprofits, which that's a whole other thing. The law doesn't say anything about for-profit organizations. So a bakery, for example, a wedding venue that works on a for-profit basis is not protected by this. And that's a criticism that some have had. But the law remains silent, and essentially that will probably get litigated in the courts. But anyway, so this pertains to nonprofit religious organizations, including churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, non-denominational ministries, interdenominational and ecumenical organizations, mission organizations, faith-based social agencies, religious educational institutions, and nonprofit entities whose principal purpose is the study, practice, or advancement of religion, and any employee of such organization shall not be required to provide services, accommodations, advantages, facilities, goods, or privileges for the solemnization or celebration of a marriage. Any refusal under this subsection to provide such services, accommodations, advantages, facilities, goods, or privileges shall not create any civil claim or cause of action. So, so you can see the, let's put this. You can see that the purpose here is to protect First Amendment rights. It assures nonprofits that they don't have to worry about being taken to court or facing a lawsuit. They don't have to face a choice between practicing their convictions or facing a lawsuit. And so in my own context as a minister, this has been a challenge, or it's been something that's been in the back of my mind for quite some time. What were to happen if I were to be asked to officiate at a same-sex marriage and same-sex wedding? And I would have to choose between honoring my conscience, my personal conscience and convictions, as well as that of the broader denomination, the Christian Reformed Church, or facing a lawsuit. Now, this legislation protects that. This ensures that that won't have to be a choice that I make. And it offers protections for other organizations, colleges and universities, and Christian camps and Christian mission agencies. It allows them to practice and to abide by their own personal conscience and convictions. And I think that's a really good thing. Now, to step back, so in order to critique this a little bit, or in order to evaluate this just a little bit, let me maybe take a step back and really because what this all is about, it's really a question that the church has wrestled with really since the very beginning of time, and that is, what is the relationship between the church and the state? How do these two entities relate to one another? To what extent can and should the government control the church, and in what extent does the church have to influence and control the government? And then individual believers, where do we fit in all of that? That's really what this is all about. And there's, over history, there have been all kinds of answers given to it, and some have said, the best thing that Christians can do is really to avoid the broader culture, avoid any participation in politics, because politics gets messy and you have to then do things that you might not really want to do. Others have really believed that the best thing that Christians can do is go to war against culture and try to fight against it and try to institute and impose Christian rules and principles and beliefs on the broader population. So there's all these, and I'm giving you just a very brief explanation here, but that really kind of sums up what that tension always has been. And that's really what this issue is about. It's about, at least a big part of it is, to what extent can the government tell the church what they can and must do, and to what extent do Christians expect the government to adopt traditional Christian values and principles? To get a little bit more technical, there's a movement in Reformed theology, especially, that's known as what's called the two-kingdom theory. And the two-kingdom theory, I think, actually is helpful here. I don't like everything about what's called the 2K, but I think there's something here that's helpful. The two-kingdom theory really recognizes that there are sort of two realms in which God governs. On the one hand, there's the spiritual kingdom, which is especially pertaining to the individual heart of believers and to the church. And in the spiritual kingdom, God has a mandate and a responsibility for believers, which is to worship him, to serve him, to obey him. It involves relationship with God and personal piety. And this is really what this really speaks to what the church should be doing, right? In the spiritual kingdom, it says, what should the church primarily focus on? Does the church have to engage in all kinds of political issues and social issues, or primarily does the church focus on doing what the church is called to do, namely making disciples, worship, practice of sacraments, and so on? And so that's the spiritual kingdom. And then the worldly kingdom, or the broader kingdom, is that of the institutions of this world. It's the way that, how does God preserve and uphold society as a whole? And there are governments in place, and there's laws in place that are meant to create structure and order. And this traces back to the covenant that God makes with Noah, where God says that he's going to preserve all of creation. But there's a distinction between how God governs the spiritual kingdom and the rest of the world, the kingdom of this world. And so you have to make sure that each kingdom is fulfilling its proper responsibility. But when you do that, I'm making it sound cleaner than it really is, because we live, when you think about the broader culture, the broader society, we live in a very pluralistic country, and that's as it should be. We live in a culture and in a country where you've got Muslims, and you've got Hindus, and you've got agnostics, and you've got humanists, and you've got Buddhists, and all kinds of other people from different backgrounds. And so one of the questions I think that Christians have to ask is, how do you govern in a way that will protect the rights of all the citizens, and promote the interests and promote the flourishing of the whole of society? I mean, you can't please everybody all the time, but how do you have to remember that you can't just govern for one particular group of people, be it Hindus or Muslims or Christians or humanists or whatever. You have to have laws that are going to serve the whole public. And that means that there are going to be some laws and some rules that are in place that Christians may, on a personal level, find objectionable. But because they recognize that it's meant to govern and oversee the whole of culture, we may recognize that it's a valid law, or it's a law that we can support and get behind. in marriage, and I think this law does that. I think the Respect for Marriage Act actually does a pretty good job of it. I think it does manage to protect the interests of Christians. It allows freedom for Christians and other religious people, but it also protects and promotes the rights of the broader culture. Even if I personally don't agree with same-sex marriage, I can say this law is good because it works for the good of the vast majority of the population. Marriage has always, it's sort of interesting. Marriage really has I think for a very, very long time, it's been composed really of two parts. You have, on the one hand, you have the religious aspect of it, which is where a married couple seeks God's favor upon their marriage. They want to marry in a way that is in line with God's will and is pleasing to God. And they want, God's, and that's going to depend on, of course, whatever religion or non-religion a person is a part of. And so a couple should expect and should be able to have their religious rights honored and protected in marriage. But a marriage today also has a second component to it, and that's what always takes place. When I was a kid growing up, they'd always do this as part of the wedding ceremony. We don't do that anymore, but when I perform a ceremony here, I always have to make very, very sure that I talk to the couple after the ceremony really briefly, because they need to sign the license, because there's a civil component to a marriage as well. It's not just a spiritual arrangement, but there's a legal aspect to it, because the government has something to say about who can marry. Can 20 people all marry each other? Can men and women, does it men and men? I mean, there's a whole lot of questions about that. And can relatives marry each other, for example? Or what happens when a marriage dissolves and the property has to be divided up? I mean, these are questions that really don't involve the church as much as they do the state. These are what the state, and now, of course, I'm simplifying it because there is obviously overlap in that. But my point is that marriage really has both sides, has both parts of it, especially in the Christian tradition. Now, I sort of dream about, if they made me king for a day, what would I do about this? I think one of the ways around this would be to recognize, just to pull those two parts separate, and really say that the state is going to oversee, and the state can decide who's going to get married in terms of any kind of ceremony, and then the church should have a right to say, well, if you want to get married in the church, then here are the ceremonies that we perform. And I think, in a sense, that's really what that's the effect of this law. This law does give a lot of freedom to organizations to perform the marriages that they want to do. But by the way, I mean, it's not, I'm focusing on that, but it's bigger than that, because it also addresses, Christian adoption agencies and colleges and universities and Christian camps and all those sorts of things. So it protects that. And I think that's a good thing. I think this law, in that sense, is effective. As Christians, we can't and we shouldn't expect that we're going to impose Christian values and beliefs on the whole of society. That's just not realistic. And I would say that's not what we're called to do as Christians. We're called instead to be a community of people who are shaped by and living by our convictions and beliefs, and we should adhere to what we believe. But we also have to recognize that the broader culture, broader society is not necessarily going to honor that and to abide by that. And I think we can accept that. Now, that gives all the more reason for missions and evangelism and discipleship and calling people to faith, but it does not necessarily follow that we should expect that all of society adopts and adheres to traditional Christian beliefs and practices. Hey, thanks for watching. This has been another episode of Speaking Of. We've been speaking of the Respect for Marriage Act. If you like what you see, leave a comment, give your feedback, and don't forget to subscribe and like the channel. And we'll catch you next time. Thank you.